So what I'm trying to do is get children listening to classical music. Before then, they might actually start playing an instrument and playing in an orchestra. And I think perhaps what a lot of people don't realise is that playing in an orchestra is one of the most profound, collaborative, emotional experiences that is out there. I mean, it's literally can be as many as 100 people all together on stage, all going through the same emotional journey. With, of course, the whole orchestra following them on that journey as well. So it's a really incredible emotional, collaborative phenomenon. The only thing that I think is similar to that is big sporting events, but of course in sport it's always a competition, and the thing about an orchestral performance is that everybody participates and no one loses, and I think that's a really important thing for children to engage in and for anyone to engage in, really. And what we're doing is we're introducing children to this for something that they can have lifelong enrichment out of.
What is kind of the target age of the child that you think is primed to be reached with this classical music message and spark that interest in them for the rest of their lives?
Yeah, it's aimed at kids, I would say about 6 to 8 years old. I've had some friends whose children as young as 4 have listened to it as a bedtime story, but I think that's kind of the youngest that might be able to sort of cope with it. But the thing about children aged about 6 to 8 years old, or maybe a little bit older, is that that's when they're first starting to think about maybe playing an instrument. And so for them, it's a way of actually introducing them to all this music before they even actually might pick up a trumpet or a violin or any other instrument. So what I want to do with this is have them absorb this music and know a lot of the tunes already, and then when it comes to maybe playing in an orchestra a few years' time, when the piece of music Sheherazade comes up, then they would sit there and think, oh well, I know how this goes already. They had the oral understanding of the music, and that helps so much for them to actually to learn playing their instruments, playing that piece of music on their instrument, because they've heard it already, and their mind can focus instead on the technical challenges of actually working their way through the notes.
I actually, as a child, found a dusty old vintage copy of Arabian Nights in my grandma's reading room and read through it. So I think it's a very appropriate story for children, but I'm sure you get a couple of looks like, isn't this the one about the princess who's trying not to get her head cut off? I mean, do you have any resistance from parents on the core of the story that you're presenting?
Oh, I mean, absolutely not. I think this is such a much-loved story, and the thing about the 1001 Nights is that there's stories within stories within stories, and so on, and there's so many of them. So it's Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, it's Aladdin, it's Sinbad the Sailor, and it's the story of Sheherazade herself, which is in fact part of a bigger story, even when you look into it. So there's so many different stories there, and I think the kind of I guess the violence in the story is something that I treat with complete humour in what I've written. I mean, you've got to accept it. Kids love that kind of humour and violence. If you look at Tom and Jerry cartoons and so on, So I think it treated in the right way. It's not an issue at all. And I think there's so much loved stories that I think any parents would be happy for their children to engage in them. I've tested it with my students and had some really nice feedback about it. And one of my favourite moments was a couple of my students asking me how old one of the characters was in the story, and it sounds like a really old grandma, but it's actually a 33-year-old bloke who's doing the voice. So it's quite funny for me to have them ask that. They were obviously quite into the story, and of course I didn't want to spoil it, so I told them that she was something like 110 years old, and they seemed to buy that.